The money fell at 2:17 on a Saturday afternoon, and my son saw it before anyone else did. I was 3 slips down, underneath the engine hatch of a 42-foot sport fisher whose port engine had been running rough for 2 weeks, and whose owner had called me on a Thursday, and whose problem I had identified as a fouled injector within 11 minutes of opening the hatch.
What is this?
I was in the middle of the replacement when I heard Finn's voice. Not calling me, just talking. The specific quality of my son's voice when he was addressing an adult, the particular combination of courtesy and directness that 11 years old and 7 years of being raised by a man who believed that you said what you meant had produced. I did not hear what he said. I heard the quality of it. I came up from the hatch. The scene on the dock was this: a man I did not recognize, 60 years old approximately, in a jacket that told you money without announcing it, standing with a woman and another man near the gangway of a 78-foot Hatteras. Finn was standing in front of the older man with both hands extended, holding something. He was holding money. A lot of money, as it turned out. $10,000 in $100 bills that had scattered across the dock when the envelope split on impact, which Finn had gathered and held, and which he was now returning to the man who had dropped them. The woman was to the side. She had the look of someone who had said something that had not had the intended effect. I would find out what she had said in approximately 22 minutes, when I finished the injector replacement and came up from the hatch for the second time and found the older man sitting on a dock piling 6 feet from my boat, waiting. But I am getting ahead of it. What I saw from the hatch at 2:17 was my son standing in front of a stranger with $10,000 in his hand saying something I could not hear. The man looked at the money. He looked at Finn. He looked at the woman. He said something. Finn said something. The man took the money. He said something else to Finn, and Finn nodded, and Finn came back toward the sport fisher, and I said, from the hatch, "What was that?" He said, "He dropped his money. There was a lot of it." I said, "You returned it." He said, "It wasn't mine." He sat down on the dock cleat with his notebook. He kept a notebook, had kept one since he was 9, for mechanical observations and questions about things he did not yet understand, and he opened it and began writing something, and I went back into the hatch. I want to tell you about the shop before I tell you about the dock, because the dock only makes sense if you understand the shop, and the shop only makes sense if you understand my father. My father, Raymond Garrett, had been a diesel mechanic in North Charleston his entire working life. Not the Charleston of the historic district and the harbor tours and the restaurants that made the lists, but North Charleston, the specific working city that existed alongside the tourist city, and that had the specific quality of a place where people knew what things cost because they had always had to know. Raymond had worked on large diesel engines in large vehicles, trucks, industrial equipment, the specific heavy-use machines that kept the port of Charleston operating, and that required the particular knowledge of someone who understood not just what was wrong, but why it had gone wrong, and what the going wrong meant about what needed to change. He had been good at it, not celebrated. The specific invisible competence of someone whose work was essential and whose name was known only to the people who needed it. He had brought me to the shop from the time I could hold a wrench safely, which was approximately 6 years old. Not to teach me mechanics specifically, to teach me the principle underneath the mechanics. He had said it once, directly, when I was 8 years old and had asked him how he knew what was wrong with an engine before he opened it up. He had said, "You listen. The machine tells you what's wrong if you're willing to hear it, but first you have to understand what right sounds like. You have to know right before you can hear wrong." I had thought about this for the rest of my life. I had gone to Trident Technical College for marine technician certification, the specific application of what Raymond had taught me to the specific machines that Charleston's waterfront produced in significant numbers, which were boats. I had worked for a marina in Mount Pleasant for 6 years, learning the specific systems and failure modes and repair requirements of marine engines in the way that you learned things when the learning was paid work and when the paid work was demanding, and when demanding was what you had needed. I had opened Garrett Marine in 2015, at 29 years old, in a small waterfront shop in North Charleston with 2 lifts and a tool inventory that I had been building for 6 years, and with the specific intention of doing what Raymond had done, being the person whose name was known to the people who needed it. Kelly had been there from the beginning, She had been a dental hygienist, and she had the specific quality of someone who worked with people at a moment of vulnerability and who was good at making the vulnerable moment bearable. Not by false reassurance, but by genuine presence, by the specific quality of someone who was completely there. She had brought this quality to everything she did, including to me, and I had understood from the first month of knowing her that she was the person who was going to make me better at being a person. We had married in 2011. Finn had been born in 2014. Kelly had died in 2018 from antiphospholipid syndrome, a rare autoimmune condition in which the immune system produced antibodies that caused the blood to clot abnormally, leading to strokes and organ damage that the treatment had not been able to prevent. She had been 32 years old. Finn had been 4. I had kept the shop open. I had been Finn's father every day. I had done both of these things because both of them required doing, and because I had understood, from watching Raymond all my life, that a man who did what needed doing was the only kind of man worth being. Finn had grown up in the shop, and at the marina, and on the docks the way that children grew up in the places that were the fabric of their family's life. He had his mother's quality of genuine presence, the ability to be completely in the moment he was in without the distracted quality that many children had, the specific, focused engagement of someone who was actually here. He had my father's belief that things told you what they were if you were willing to listen, and he had, from some combination of the two or from something entirely his own, the specific quality that I had never had to teach directly, and that was simply present from the time he was old enough to understand the question, the understanding that what was not yours, that this was not a complex question, and that the answer to it did not change based on who was watching. He had said it first when he was 6. A classmate had left a dollar bill on the floor of the school bus, and Finn had picked it up and returned it to the driver to hold until the owner was found, and his teacher had called me that afternoon to tell me about it, and I had asked Finn about it at dinner. He had said, "I saw myself pick it up, so I knew." I had said, "So you knew what?" He had said that I'd have to decide, and it wasn't mine, so it wasn't really a decision. I had not said anything for a moment. He had gone back to his dinner. I had thought about that for a long time. The woman's name was Renata Farwell. I did not know this at 2:17 when I was watching from the hatch. I learned it later, in the sequence of things that the afternoon produced, and I want to tell you what she had said to Finn in the 30 seconds between the money falling and Finn returning it, because what she said is the center of the story and because it was not what you might expect. She had not been cruel. That is the important thing to understand about Renata Farwell. She was not a cruel person. She was a person who had a specific understanding of the world, the understanding of someone who had always existed in proximity to money, and for whom money was the solution to most problems, including the moral ones. And what she had said to Finn had come from that understanding and had been, from inside that understanding, generous. The envelope had fallen from Conrad Hale's jacket pocket when he reached for his phone. It had hit the dock planking and split on impact, and the bills had scattered. $10,000 in $100 bills across the planking of a Charleston Harbor dock in April. Finn had gathered them, quickly, holding the stack, and had looked at the denomination and understood that it was significant. Renata had watched him gather the bills. She had looked at Finn's clothes, work clothes, not expensive, his shoes, worn, the specific wear pattern of shoes that were used for everything. She had looked 3 slips down at the sport fisher and at the mechanic's tools visible on the dock and at the mechanic's truck in the lot with Garrett Marine on the side. She had assembled an understanding of the situation in the time it took Finn to gather the money, and then she had said, "Honey, you keep that. You look like you could use it." She had meant it kindly. That is the specific thing about what she said. She had meant it as a gift. She had looked at a child who she had assessed as not having much, and she had decided that the money should solve that problem, and that the question of whose money it was secondary to the solution. Finn had looked at her. He had said, "It's not mine." She had said, "Finders keepers. Nobody saw you pick it up." Finn had said, "I saw me pick it up." He had walked to Conrad Hale. Conrad Hale had built Hale Capital Group from a single real estate transaction in 1994, a distressed commercial property in Savannah that he had bought with borrowed money and sold 14 months later for a profit that he had immediately reinvested. and had spent the following 30 years building the specific kind of business that came from doing the same thing correctly at increasing scale. He was 56 years old and had the specific quality of someone who had earned what he had in the specific way that earning was the word, not through inheritance, not through the accumulated advantages of a wealthy beginning, but through the 30-year application of the principle his own father had given him, which was that what people did when they thought no one was looking told you who they were, and that the only reliable way to build anything lasting was with people who behaved the same way, watched and unwatched. He had applied this principle to thousands of people over 30 years. He had not applied it to Renata. He had not applied it to Renata because Renata was accomplished and beautiful, and because the wedding was 8 days away, and because the not applying had been easier than the applying. When Finn stood in front of him on the dock with $10,000 in his hands and said, "Excuse me, you dropped this," Conrad had taken the money and said thank you, and he had asked Finn his name, and Finn had told him, and Conrad had looked at Renata. She had the expression of someone who had done the generous thing and who had watched it not work. Conrad had understood the sequence of events completely. He was a man who had spent 30 years reading situations. He understood what had happened in the 30 seconds between the money falling and the boy standing in front of him. He had said, "Thank you, Finn." He had said it to Finn. He had walked to the sport fisher. He was sitting on the dock piling when I came up from the hatch at 2:39. 22 minutes he had been sitting there, in his jacket and his money, on a dock piling, waiting for a marine mechanic to finish a job. Not impatiently, the specific quality of someone who had decided to wait and who was at rest in the waiting, who had not checked his phone in the time I could observe him, and who was simply present on the piling in the way of someone who had nowhere more important to be. This was the first thing I noticed about Conrad Hale. I said, "Sorry for the wait. Port injector. Had to run clean before I could button her up." He said, "I'm Conrad Hale. Your son returned $10,000 to me a few minutes ago." I looked at Finn. Finn said, "It wasn't mine, Dad." I said, "No, it wasn't." I wiped my hands. I said, "What can I do for you, Mr. Hale?" He said, "I'd like to talk, if you have time." I said, "I've got 20 minutes before I need to button up and run the engine. You want to sit?" He said, "Yes." We sat on the dock, me on the gunwale of the sport fisher, Conrad on the piling, Finn on the dock cleat with his notebook. The Charleston Harbor was doing what April harbors did in Charleston, which was be exactly as beautiful as it always was and require nothing of the people near it except that they be present to it. Conrad said, "Before your son walked to me, my fiancé told him to keep the money." I looked at Finn. Finn had not looked up from his notebook. I said, "What did he say?" Conrad said, "He said it wasn't his. She said, 'Finders keepers.' Nobody saw him pick it up. He said he saw himself pick it up." I said, "Yes." Conrad said, "He's done this before." I said, "Since he was 6, a dollar bill on a school bus." Conrad was quiet for a moment. He said, "He didn't think about it." I said, "He thought about it. He just didn't think it was complicated." Conrad said, "Most people think it's complicated when there's $10,000 involved." I said, "Finn doesn't think the amount changes the question." Conrad looked at my son on the dock cleat. He said, "How old was he when his mother died?" I said, 4. Conrad said, "He's 11 now." I said, "Yes." Conrad looked at the harbor. He said, "I grew up without money. Not desperately. My father worked. We had what we needed. But I understood early that money was a test. That what people did with money that wasn't theirs told you who they were." I said, "And?" He said, "In 30 years of testing that principle, I have never seen someone with as little as your son has pass it that cleanly, without hesitation, without looking to see who was watching." I said, "He wasn't passing a test. He was returning what wasn't his." Conrad said, "I know that's what he was doing. That's what I mean." Finn, from the dock cleat, said, "The Hatteras. Is that a twin screw or triple?" Conrad looked at him. He said, "Twin. 2 Caterpillar C-32s." Finn wrote something in his notebook. He said, "What's the cruise speed?" Conrad said, "About 25 knots." Finn nodded and wrote something else. Conrad looked at me. I said, "He's interested in marine mechanics." Conrad said, I see that. I said, he comes with me on jobs when he can. He's been doing it since he was 6. Conrad said, same age as the dollar bill. I said, yes. Conrad stood up. He said, I need to let you finish your work. He put out his hand. I shook it. He said, what you've built in him. It's the most important work there is. I said, he built it. I just showed up. Conrad said, that's the work. He walked back toward the Hatteras. I went back into the hatch. Conrad Hale did not cancel the wedding in the heat of the dock moment. He was not impulsive. He had built 30 years of something from the specific discipline of not being impulsive, of sitting with information until the information had fully assembled itself and until the decision that the information required was clear. He sat with what he had seen on the dock for 4 days. Not the money, not Finn's honesty, which was real and which he had recognized immediately as the specific quality of something that had been built over years rather than performed in the moment. What he sat with was Renata's advice. He had known, on the dock, what it had revealed. Not about Renata's character in the large sense. She was not a dishonest person, not a cruel person, not a person he had been wrong about in the general way. He had known, on the dock, that it had revealed something specific, the way Renata understood moral questions. She had looked at Finn, and she had not seen a child facing a question. She had seen a child who could benefit from a solution. The solution was money. She had offered the solution. What she had not seen, what she had specifically removed from the situation by offering the solution, was Finn's moral agency. She had decided for Finn what Finn should do because she had decided that what Finn needed was more important than what was right. Conrad had spent 30 years building something on the premise that what was right was more important than what was convenient, and that this premise was non-negotiable, because the moment you negotiated it, you no longer had a premise but an approximation. He had found, in the 4 days, that he could not marry someone for whom the premise was negotiable. He had not wanted to find this. He had found it. He called Renata on Wednesday morning. He drove to her house on Lagar Street, the specific beautiful Charleston street of the historic district where her townhouse occupied the 2nd and 3rd floors of a building that had been there since 1847. He sat across from her in her living room with its specific beautiful furnishings, and he told her what he had been thinking since Saturday. He did not accuse her. He told her what he had seen, her advice to Finn, Finn's response, and he told her what it had shown him, not about her, but about the specific difference in how they understood the world, the specific gap between her understanding and his that had been invisible until the dock, and that was not invisible anymore. She had said, "You're canceling the wedding over a child returning money." He had said, "I'm canceling the wedding because of what you said to him before he returned it." She had said, "I was trying to help him." He had said, "I know. That's what I've been thinking about for 4 days." She had been quiet. He had said, "I looked at you on that dock and I understood something I should have understood sooner. The fault for not understanding it sooner is mine." She had said, "What did you understand?" He had said, "That you and I don't have the same answer to the question the boy was facing, and that for me that question is the one where the answer has to be the same or nothing else holds." She had said, "It was $10,000, Conrad. He could have had a better year." He had said, "Yes, that's what I mean." He called me on Thursday. I was in the shop working on a 32-foot center console whose trim tabs had been giving intermittent problems, and Finn was in the corner on a stool doing his school reading with the specific distracted quality of someone who was reading, but also listening to the sounds the shop made, which he had been doing since he was 6. My phone rang. The number was one I did not know. Conrad Hale said, "I hope I'm not interrupting." I said, "Trim tabs, you're not interrupting." He said, "I called to tell you I canceled the wedding." I was quiet for a moment. He said, "I didn't want you to find out some other way. Charleston is a small city in the ways that matter." I said, "I'm sorry." He said, "Don't be. It was the right decision." I said, "Was it because of the dock?" He said, "It was because of what the dock showed me. There's a difference." He paused. He said, "I want to tell you something. What your son did, it wasn't just the returning. It was how he said what he said. He said he saw himself pick it up. I've been in business for 30 years and I've heard every version of justification and rationalization, and I've never heard anyone make the simple case that clearly. He didn't say it was wrong to keep it. He said he knew he'd picked it up, and therefore he knew what he needed to do. I said, he's been saying that for 5 years. He said, since the dollar bill. I said, you looked us up. He said, Philip did. I wanted to understand the context. I said, and? He said, and the context is a marine mechanic who has been raising his son alone since the boy was 4, and who runs an honest business, and who brings his son to work so the boy understands what work is. I don't need more context than that. He paused. He said, I'd like to offer Finn something. Not money. I think we've established what he thinks about money that isn't his. A summer internship on the Seraphine, working with my marine engineer. If Finn is serious about marine mechanics, I'd like him to learn what a 78-foot Hatteras looks like from the inside. I said, I'll ask him. He said, the offer isn't a reward. I want to be clear about that. The offer is, I'd like to know him better. A boy who says he saw himself pick it up is someone I'd like to spend time around. I said, I'll ask him. He said, Will. I said, yes. He said, what you've built in that boy. I want you to know that I understand how long it takes to build something like that and what it costs, and that I recognize it. I said, he built it. I provided the context. He said, yes, that's the work, exactly. I told Finn about the internship that evening. He was at the kitchen table with his homework and his notebook open beside it. He always had the notebook beside the homework, which had initially seemed to me like a distraction, and which had turned out to be the way he processed things. The notebook for the things that needed thinking that were not the homework. I sat across from him. I said, Mr. Hale called today. He looked up. I said, he's offered you an internship this summer, on the Seraphine, working with his marine engineer. Finn looked at me. He said, the Hatteras. I said, yes. He said, twin Caterpillar C-32s. I said, yes. He said, what's the engineering configuration? The Hatteras 78 can run twin or triple screw depending on the build year. I said, I didn't ask. He said, I'll ask him. I said, is that a yes? He thought about it for approximately 2 seconds. He said, yes. I said, Finn. He said, yeah. I said, the man called off his wedding because of what happened on the dock. Finn looked at me with the specific quality of someone who was receiving information and who was deciding what the information meant. He said, because of what I did? I said, because of what he saw. There's a difference. He said, what did he see? I said, he saw the choice you made. And he saw something else that the choice made visible. Finn was quiet for a moment. He said, like when you're working on an engine and you find something you weren't looking for and it changes what you do next. I said, exactly like that. He said, he found something he wasn't looking for. I said, yes. Finn nodded slowly. He said, is he okay? I said, I think he will be. Finn said, good. He went back to his homework. He wrote something in the notebook. I sat across from him in the kitchen of the North Charleston house that had been ours since before he was born, and that had Kelly in it still. In the specific way that houses held people who had been fully in them, in the light quality of a particular afternoon and the specific creak of the third stair and the kitchen window that let in the sound of the street in the summer. And I thought about what Conrad had said. What you've built in him. I had not built it. I had shown him what right looked like. Raymond had shown me what right looked like. Raymond's father had probably shown Raymond. The showing was the only work available. You showed what right looked like and you hoped the showing was sufficient. In Finn's case, it had been. In Finn's case, it had been more than sufficient. Sunday dinner at Gale's house was the specific Sunday dinner that had been the anchor of the week since before I could remember. The same recipes, the same kitchen, the specific smell of a house that had been cooking the same things for 40 years, and that had the settled quality of a place that knew exactly what it was. Gale was 67 years old, and had the specific quality of a woman who had raised someone correctly, and who watched the results of that raising with the satisfied attention of someone who had invested carefully and who was watching the return. She had put the food on the table and she had listened to me tell the story. The dock, the money, Renata's advice, Finn's response, the 4 days, the canceled wedding, Conrad's call, the internship. She had listened without interruption, which was how Gail listened to things she considered important. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. She said, "The woman told him he could use it." I said, "Yes." She said, "And he said he saw himself pick it up." I said, "Yes." She was quiet for another moment. She said, "Kelly would have laughed." I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "At the woman, telling him he could use it. Kelly would have thought that was the funniest thing she ever heard. She would have said Finn was never going to keep money that wasn't his, and that anyone who thought he would hadn't been paying attention." I said, "She would have been right." Gail said, "She always was about him. From the time he was 2, she said he was going to be the kind of person who knew the difference." I said, "The difference between what?" Gail said, "Between what was his and what wasn't. Between what he could keep and what he had to give back." She said it like it was just an observation, like she was describing the weather. I did not say anything for a moment. Gail put more food on my plate without asking, which was the specific Gail language for, "I see you and you need this, and I am not going to make it a conversation." Finn said, "Is the internship on the Hatteras in Charleston, or does the boat go somewhere?" Gail said, "It's a boat, baby. It goes somewhere." Finn said, "Good. I want to see how it handles offshore." I said, "You're 11. He said, "Dad, I've been on your boat since I was 6. I said, "My boats are 42 feet. He said, "The Hatteras is 78. Gail said, "Let the child go on the big boat." I said, "Twin Caterpillar C32s. Finn said, "That's not a reason to not go." Gail said, "I don't know what that means, but I agree with him." I looked at my son across the Sunday dinner table. 11 years old, with Kelly's quality of genuine presence, and Raymond's belief that machines told you what they were if you listened, and the specific additional thing that was entirely his own, which was the understanding that what was not yours, and that this was not a complicated question. He had seen himself pick it up. That was all. That was the whole thing. He had seen himself pick it up, and he had known what he had to do, and he had done it, and he had not thought about who was watching because who was watching had not been part of the question. Gail said, "Kelly would have been so proud of him." I said, "Yes." She said, "She would have pretended not to be surprised. She would have said she always knew." I said, "She always did know." Gail said, "Yes, she did." The Sunday dinner was around us. The kitchen and the recipes and the specific smell of 40 years of the same things, and Finn eating and asking about the Hatteras's offshore handling characteristics, and Gail answering in the specific way of a grandmother who did not know the answer but who was not going to let not knowing stop her from having a position. Outside, the North Charleston Sunday was doing what it did, the specific quality of a southern city on a Sunday afternoon in April, the light and the warmth and the particular ease of a day that was not asking anything of anyone. Kelly would have laughed. She would have been right. She always was. Before you go, I want to ask you something. Has there been a moment when someone you raised, a child, a younger person you mentored, someone you showed the way to, did the right thing without hesitation, without looking to see who was watching, without calculating the cost? And, in that moment, did you understand that the most important work you had ever done was not visible in any way you could point to? Tell me about it in the comments. I read every single one. If this story stayed with you today, share it with one person who needs to hear it. You already know who that is. And if you're new here, subscribe. Every week, a story like this one. Real people, real decisions, the kind that stay with you.